In this program, we will deal with the properties that characterize life. We will then talk about the simplest forms of life, microorganisms. And lastly, we will look into what the findings of genetics has taught us about the origins of man. In science fiction stories and films, mad scientists, tempted by the impossible, somehow manage to create living beings. Frankenstein's monster is a popular example. At the time the novel was written, man had just invented electricity. It's therefore not surprising that Victor Frankenstein managed to give life to his patchwork cadaver by subjecting it to an electric shock. Scientists also benefit from the new technologies, not so much to create life, but rather to discover its properties. Living organisms differ from inert matter by their capacity to perform certain particular activities we call basic functions. These basic functions that define life are self-preservation, self-replication, and self-regulation. The elementary structure capable of accomplishing those three basic functions is the cell. The cell is the structural unit of all living organisms. By itself, it can constitute a living being. This is the case of unicellular organisms, which include bacteria, and which probably encompass the largest number of living things on Earth. As for multicellular organisms, of which man is one, they can consist of up to several 100 trillion assembled cells. The first basic function of all living things is self-preservation. It enables them to stay alive. By nutrition, organisms absorb the foods they need to maintain their vital reactions and to grow. Once absorbed, the foods are decomposed to yield an energy that can be used by the cells directly. Every cell must continually maintain its infrastructure, which is subjected to the irreversible degradation of time. A living thing can only remain what it is by a constant expense of energy and matter. Thus, through the processes of self-preservation, every living thing converts matter into energy, which it uses economically. This energy, in the form of molecules called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is the universal fuel of all life forms. In the higher organisms, these energy-rich molecules are usually obtained through a form of combustion called respiration, or breathing. Contrary to popular belief, breathing does not occur in the lungs or the bronchi, but in minute organs located in the cells. Oxygen, together with food broken down during digestion, is forwarded through the bloodstream to the cells. At the cellular level, glucose molecules that derive in large part from sugars, but also from fats and proteins, are burnt in the presence of oxygen. This reaction, called respiration, releases a substantial quantity of energy stored in the form of ATP. Concurrently with the breathing, part of the broken down food is assimilated by other small cell organs in order to repair deteriorated parts of the organism or to help it grow. This is how life is sustained. That continuity, however, is only possible if the mechanisms that rule it are controlled. Self-regulation is the second basic function that enables life to control itself. Self-regulation aims primarily at maintaining a living organism in a state of balance. It involves the coordination and control of the vital reactions as a whole. The rates of food supply, combustion, and assimilation therefore adjust to each other depending upon the external changes that may occur. For example, during strenuous physical exercise, the organism needs a great deal of energy, so it will begin to burn up a lot of glucose. This reaction produces a large concentration of carbon dioxide in the form of waste. The buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood will cause the blood pressure to rise and the heartbeat and breathing to quicken. Occurring simultaneously, these actions will cause the carbon dioxide to be expelled from the tissues in greater amounts, course through the bloodstream faster, and be eliminated by the lungs faster. The resulting drop in the concentration of carbon dioxide will bring the blood pressure, heartbeat, and breathing down. The third and final essential function of life is self-replication. It is this function that enables the cell to multiply so that life can go on. In both primitive unicellular organisms and in complex organisms, this function takes place under the guidance of the nucleic acids, the basic constituents of genes. However, methods of reproduction vary. In primitive organisms, reproduction occurs by fission or cellular division. The net result of cellular division is the splitting of one cell into two cells, containing exactly identical genes. Consequently, the structural and functional potential of the two daughter cells is the same as the mother cells. This type of reproduction is said to be asexual. On the other hand, reproduction said to be sexual involves the fusion of two specialized reproducing cells, one male bearing the name of spermatozoon, and the other female called ovum. Finally, death is a characteristic inherent in all living matter. Living organisms can, however, transcend it in a way by reproducing. One of the first artificially created human beings, the Golem, died as soon as someone wrote the word death on its forehead. The Golem belongs to Jewish folklore. It was a creature, a magician made out of clay. We know that for centuries, magic was very much a part of people's lives. Anything that could not be explained was ascribed to magic or divine intervention. The plague, for instance, was long thought to be God's punishment. But how could anyone attest to the existence of Yersinia pestis, the bacillus responsible for the plague, before the invention of the microscope? There are numerous microorganisms. They are responsible for all sorts of phenomena. Let's take a much closer look. Microorganisms are organisms that can only be seen under a microscope. They are found virtually everywhere in nature. Microorganisms are the cause of a great many diseases, such as the plague, diphtheria, smallpox, and cholera, which have been the bane of man's existence for centuries on end. Others play a useful role in man's everyday activities, such as wine, cheese and yogurt making, the production of penicillin, and even the purification of wastewater. Further, countless numbers of these microscopic beings live in the bodies of humans and animals, where they form an active microbian flora that ensures that organs such as the intestines are in good working order. The world of microorganisms is divided into 5 separate groups: bacteria, microscopic algae, protozoa, fungi, and viruses. Microorganisms can be grouped into 2 major categories based on how their cellular contents are organized. Some unicellular organisms have no internal membrane separating the filaments that make up the genetic material from the rest of the cell. These organisms replicate by simple fission, the characteristic means of asexual reproduction. Bacteria belong to this category of microorganisms. Then there are other microorganisms whose structure is far more complex. They have an intricate system of internal membranes. Their genetic material is isolated in a special receptacle, the nucleus. Apart from viruses, which constitute a special case, The protozoa, fungi, and algae are structured this way. Unlike all other microorganisms composed of a single cell, protozoa are motile. Their mode of locomotion is even used to differentiate certain classes of protozoans. For example, amoebas move by means of retractable pseudopodia. Ciliates advance by beating minute hairs or cilia. Flagellates move by using whip-like extensions called flagella. For this reason, protozoa are said to have animal characteristics. They account for a large part of the zooplankton on which marine organisms feed. But they are also the source of a serious medical problem in tropical and subtropical regions because they transmit diseases, such as malaria, through insects. Fungi come in both unicellular and multicellular form. Yeasts, one of the two categories of fungi, are unicellular. They are important in commercial fermentation processes, such as beer and wine making, as well as the baking of bread. On the other hand, mold, the other category of fungi, is filamentous and multicellular. Mold grows on oranges and cheese, for example, in the form of blue-green masses, or on jams in the form of white and hairy masses. Penicillin, the antibiotic with substantial antibacterial powers, is produced from a kind of mold. Microscopic algae make up another, special group of microorganisms. While most microscopic algae are unicellular, some are multicellular. Algae, due to the pigments they contain, including chlorophyll, accomplish photosynthesis. They therefore differ from fungi and protozoa, which are heterotrophic, that is, they require organic substances as nourishment. Viruses are not considered living cells, although they share many of cells' characteristics. Their structure is much simpler than bacteria's, but they do have substances specific to living things, nucleic acids and proteins. Viruses are said to be necessary parasites. To replicate, viruses require a living cell. They must therefore enter a living cell where they use the cellular medium to duplicate their nucleic acids. Compared to most microorganisms, viruses are extremely small. They are only visible under an electronic microscope. What is fascinating about viruses is that they are right at the borderline between complex inanimate molecules and the simplest forms of microscopic life. As to whether they are living things or merely chemical molecules, the debate goes on. It's a long way from a cell to a human being, but the path is traced thanks to the DNA molecule. What geneticists have discovered by examining the DNA molecule has shed new light on the origins of man. The most revolutionary theory holds that we are all descendants of the same woman, whom the geneticists were quick to call Eve. If this hypothesis proves correct, we would be hard-pressed to state that there are any major differences between the races. In any event, we are certainly cousins, however far removed. For a long time, the science that studies the origin of man, human paleontology, was based solely on the scrupulous observation of the outer features of fossils. However, the outer features only reveal a minute part of a species' essence. On the other hand, DNA, the main component of genes, embraces the entire history of a species as well as the kinship between species. Owing to the progress made in genetic engineering since the end of the 70s, techniques now enable us to decipher the DNA molecule, to figure out how nucleotides are sequenced to form the fragments that genes constitute. By comparing the DNA molecules of various species, scientists have managed to assess the biochemical differences between these species and hence to deduce their degree of kinship. These studies have revolutionized the conventional theses of the paleontologists. Geneticists have since stated that man, the chimpanzee, and the gorilla are much closer than we ever thought they were. But especially, they were able to prove that the homology between the chimpanzee and man is far greater than between the chimpanzee and the gorilla. The chimpanzee's brother, his twin, almost is man. Only 1 to 2% of their genes are different. Yet in spite of the fact that 98% of their genetic material is identical, the organism of a chimpanzee is quite different from a human's. Although they evolved from virtually the same ingredients, the chimpanzees and men are the products of two different evolutionary recipes. What constitute the morphological differences between two species are the form and quantity of proteins in their organisms and how these proteins are organized. Molecular biology data also demonstrates that the concept of human race, as we perceive it, through white, yellow, and black men, is of very little importance, genetically speaking. Ultimately, skin color is but the reflection of climatic adaptation and the effect of ultraviolet rays. In spite of the physical differences that let us distinguish between them, the various ethnic groups are in fact extremely close to each other genetically. Moreover, huge morphological variations can emerge within a same race. These variations can be very pronounced, sometimes much more so than most other differences observed between two separate races. Researchers have even shown that within any people, anywhere in the world, at least 85% of the total genetic variability of the human species can be observed. In final analysis, it seems quite irrelevant to group humans according to racial criteria. For example, the Melanesians of New Guinea, whose hair is black and frizzy, share only 21% of their genes with West Africans, although they look quite similar physically. On the other hand, they share 45% of their genes with the Chinese. Also, certain geneticists are trying to retrace the ancestors of modern man. Some have managed to achieve spectacular results by studying the DNA contained in mitochondria. Mitochondria are tiny organs responsible for the energy in cells. They have their own genetic material, different from that contained in the cellular nucleus. Further, the nucleotide chain that composes their DNA is much smaller than that of the nucleus. Contrary to the nucleus's DNA, which is a combination of its maternal and paternal genetic heritages, the DNA of the mitochondria is transmitted only by the mother. The study of mitochondrial DNA fragments of living persons of different origins has enabled researchers to retrace the female ancestor of the 5 billion individuals who inhabit the planet today. This mother of us all is named Eve. Eve is said to have been born in Africa over 200,000 years ago. These conclusions are based on a genetic study of the placentas from women of African, Asian, European, Near Eastern, and New Guinean origin. These findings, however, have been the subject of considerable controversy among the scientific community. The mitochondrial DNA accounts for only 0.048% of the entire human genome. In addition, it is apparently prone to more frequent mutations than the chromosomal DNA of the nucleus, which makes it less reliable. The researchers therefore believe the truth lies somewhere in the billions of nucleotides contained in the DNA of the nucleus. A project has just got underway involving the collaboration of numerous researchers and a very impressive budget. The project involves the mapping of the human genome, which will shed some light on the mysteries of the human genealogy. The project is also expected to uncover the complete sequence of the 3 billion nucleotides composing the dozens of thousands of genes that make up the genetic heritage of the human species. Statistically speaking, that all of humankind descended from a single woman is not only possible, it's quite probable. It takes some nerve to support such a hypothesis. But that's something the geneticists have plenty of.